So everyone, welcome to Sci Pol 101. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Rami Major. I'm the president of the Science Policy and Advocacy Group, or SPAG, here at UNC Chapel Hill. This is the first event in our Science Policy Certificate Series that we're hosting this spring. And through this series, you'll have the opportunity to earn a credit toward a certificate in science policy. I'll talk a little bit more about the certificate series at the end of this brief presentation, but the goal for today is really to just introduce you to the field of science policy. So today, we are hoping that you can walk away from this with the basic knowledge about what science policy is, what a career in science policy might look like. We want you to be able to know how to identify different science policy resources and learn where to find them. And then finally, we want you to, through this, learn how to get involved in science policy while you're still in school. So the big question, what is science policy? Does anyone have any thoughts? You can unmute yourself or you can put it in the chat.
I think it's related to governance that has any input from scientific research or has to do with science.
Yeah, so science policy is all about connecting your scientific expertise that you've gotten through studying a STEM topic to the world around you through things like laws, policies, regulations, or advocacy. And there are a few different ways to think about science policy, and in the science policy. I think we can you please mute if you are
I'm just going to mute anyone who's not muted.
Perfect.
That's okay if no one's offended.
Perfect. Thank you, Rosa. So in the science policy field, there are a few different ways to think about science policy. There's science for policy, and this is the process of using scientific evidence to inform policymaking. But you can also think about science policy as policy for science. And then this aspect of science policy would be thinking about the laws that govern how research is actually conducted and how it gets funded. So with these categories in mind, can anyone think of any examples of science for policy and put those in the chat? If not, I'll give you this example. So let's say you're a graduate student. Oh, great, we have some examples. Yeah, banning flavors of vaping products. That's definitely an example of science for policy. So one other example is, let's say you're a graduate student, you're studying a specific chemical and you're doing this in a mouse model to see what sort of effects this chemical has on reproductive health. You could arrange a meeting with a legislator to share the results of your work and advocate for stricter regulations of that chemical. So this is an example of science for policy. You're using scientific data to actually drive policy creation and implementation. Can anyone think of any examples of this flip side of things, policy for science? This one might be a little trickier. University research funding. Yeah, that's definitely an example of policy for science, deciding how science should get funded, which areas should be prioritized. We can also think about it more broadly. See more, CRISPR research regulation, creation of an IRB, legalizing stem cell research. Yes, all of these are examples of policy for science. Another way to think about it more broadly, maybe we've seen an increase in the number of opioid deaths, and policymakers acknowledge this and they want to prioritize the discovery of non-opioid pain relief drugs to address this issue. So one way that they can create policy for science could be to decide to allocate additional funds to sponsor pain-related research. And through this, they're showing that they're prioritizing this area of research. Hopefully they would be using this to motivate scientists to pursue this research by having the funding in place for that. So science factors into a wide variety of science policy issues, including health, environmental quality, natural resources, and water management. These are just a few examples. If you joined us for our Science Policy by Environment series back in the fall, we talked about some of these issues, specifically water regulation. But I just wanted to put this here to highlight that there are so many different fields that involve science policy, and it's not just these. Transportation, agriculture, energy, and utilities involve science policy issues as well. And we can kind of see how science policy might relate to some of these. But there are other fields too that involve STEM components that we might not see as apparently. Some of these could be, housing issues, government and public safety issues. And again, we can use scientific evidence to bolster the policy creation across all these different disciplines. So science policy is sort of this catch-all term for policy work based on evidence in a wide variety of disciplines. So when we're thinking about doing policy work, does anyone have any skills that come to mind that you think might be beneficial that you could put in the chat? Networking for sure. Critical thinking is another one I see. Communication, absolutely. Reading scientific literature. Yeah, all of these are great skills. So there's this resource called the Scientific Citizenship Initiative at Harvard Medical School, and they really wanted to compose this list of skills that they feel would be beneficial for people entering the science policy arena. And the good news is, because you are training in STEM, as I'm assuming many of you are, you already have a lot of the skills that are necessary to succeed in science policy work. So as you study toward a STEM degree, you learn to be resilient, you learn to be persistent, you gain these skills to analyze things and think critically and be curious, pursue questions and find answers. As those of us who are conducting research know, we are very familiar with the uncertainties and nuances that come along with experiments. And through our training, we really receive this intimate knowledge of the scientific process. And all of these are useful skills that can translate to the science policy arena. So other skills that you might not have as much experience with, but are just as important for a science policy career, involve things like familiarity with government structures or current policy issues, policy writing, interfacing with legislators. Someone mentioned networking. That's really important too and factors into this interpersonal skill requirement. You need to learn how to talk to people and how to communicate with people who might not be as familiar with the issue as you are. So we've talked about what sort of skills might benefit someone interested in a science policy career, but what would a science policy career actually look like? Well, the answer is there are a variety of different science policy fields that you could get a job in. So here are just a few that I've listed out, and we'll talk about these in a little bit more depth. So if you want to work in policy development and analysis, this might be a good fit if you enjoy writing and working in the nitty-gritty of policy. So in this arena, you might be performing research in the policy realm and providing expert advice to decision makers. Science diplomacy is another really interesting up-and-coming field that I think is getting a ton more visibility nowadays. And we will actually have an event as part of our certificate series later this spring that dives into science policy and some of the people doing science diplomacy work. But this might be a good fit if you enjoy interfacing with different cultures and addressing problems on a more global scale. So some examples of this could be maybe you're a scientist and you want to collaborate with a researcher in a different country. And through this, you're fostering some sort of international collaboration and effort between these two cultures working toward a common goal. If you enjoy communicating science to the general public, you might also consider a career in the field of communications and advocacy. So people in this field, again, are doing science policy work, but they're focusing on making science accessible to the general public. And if you'd rather be the person who is making decisions as opposed to informing them, you might want to explore something like policy implementation and oversight. So a role in this field could involve managing the funding and structure of scientific programs, or even developing regulatory frameworks for different issues. And I just wanted to include this slide to underscore the vast amount of companies that do science policy work. It's not just the government where you can get a science policy job. Most people will equate science policy work with working in the government. But in reality, you can do science policy jobs in the private sector, in a nonprofit, or even in academia. So this is another graphic from the Harvard Medical School resource that suggests different ways that you can prepare yourself for a science policy career. And you can do many of these things right now as a STEM student. So I won't read them all, but some examples include getting involved in student government by, you could join an executive committee or represent your department as a senator. This would really help you get a feel for how a government system is structured and what it looks like to write, pass, and implement legislation. Another great thing that you can do right now is simply expose yourself to more policy literature. A lot of us who are studying STEM are very familiar with academic writing, with scientific papers that get published, but policy texts in fields that are interesting to you might be something good to consider diving into. You can also reach out to someone who has a policy job on LinkedIn, ask for an informational interview, and then understand what the day-to-day is like of a science policy career. It never hurts to ask, and I've found personally that most people in the science policy field are extremely welcoming and very uplifting. And also, it never hurts to ask for these things. Another example of a way to prepare for a science policy career that I'll touch on just briefly is science policy fellowships. So has anyone heard of a science policy fellowship before? If you can think of any examples, you can put it in the chat. Yeah, AAAS. So that's the kind of hallmark science policy fellowship, but there are a ton of different science policy fellowships that you can apply to, get involved in across all stages of your training. So what is a science policy fellowship for those who might not know what it is? Well, if we boil it down, it's an opportunity for you to bring your scientific expertise and perspective to a congressional office, executive agency, state government, or other organization like a nonprofit or maybe a specific scientific society. And opportunities are available across all levels, including before you get your degree and after you get your degree. The AAAS fellowship that was mentioned in the chat, that's available after you complete your PhD. One great part about these science policy fellowships is they're a crucial way that you can build both your science policy skill set and network for your future career. So if this brief intro to science policy has piqued your interest and you want to dive in further, SPAG, our group, has a ton of resources on our website that you can peruse. And there's also this really great self-paced module on science policy where you can dive more into specifics of what science policy looks like. Another way you can network if you don't have the time to maybe want to dedicate entirely to a fellowship, or you're still not really sure about science policy as a field, there's a nonprofit called the National Science Policy Network, and you can join it as an early career scientist for only $20 a year. This is a great opportunity if you want to gain real-world science policy experience, learn what science policy looks like, and network with other people who are at your stage trying to expose themselves to science policy. They also have different committees that you can join if there are specific science policy issues that interest you. They have a science diplomacy committee, for example. They have a conference every year that highlights science policy work that's ongoing. It's a really cool organization, and their conference for this year is actually happening in March in Houston. But NSPN is a great resource if you're looking to get a little bit more involved in science policy beyond just UNC. And then, as I mentioned before, fellowships, you can apply for one of the many science policy fellowships. We have this resource listed on our website. I've also included it here. And if fellowships are something that you're specifically interested in, we will have an event later this semester as part of our certificate series that dives more into fellowships as well. So with that, I would be remiss to not advocate for your participation in our science policy certificate series this spring. Through this certificate series, you can earn a credit towards certificate in science policy by attending events, filling out our credit tracking form for each event. We'll send that to everyone who's attended today, but it is also listed on our website. And the requirements for achieving a basic certificate is attending Sci Pol 101, so this event, attending at least one science policy topics event. So we recognize that people are interested in a lot of different aspects of science policy, which we think is super great. So we're planning on offering multiple of these on a wide variety of science policy topics, from women's health to bioethics to the environment and science diplomacy. We're also asking that you attend at least 2 science policy workshops, where we'll give you the crucial skills to learn how to do science policy work, like writing a policy memo or writing an op-ed, learning how to talk to legislators. And we're really excited about this workshop to give people real-world skills that they could take as they move forward. And then lastly, we're requiring attendance at least one science policy career-focused event. So as I alluded to before, we will have a fellowship panel. We will also have a careers panel where you can hear from different people who are working science policy jobs and learn more about what their day-to-day looks like. So thank you so much for attending. Does anyone have any questions before I turn it over to Dr. Warren? All right, great. Well, with that, I will introduce our speaker for today, who's going to tell us about some real-world science policy work, Dr. Jeffrey Warren. He is the executive director of the NC Policy Collaboratory, and he is also our advisor for SPAG, and we're very lucky to have him. So I'll stop sharing my screen right now and hand it over to Jeff.
Thanks, Ramey. Really good job on this Science Policy 101. That kind of hit the nail on the head, and good springboard to go from there. And I hate the picture on my bio on our website. So that was a good reminder that I have to have that changed. So I'm in a very unique position, and I have gotten to play around with science policy my whole career, because I made a decision while getting my PhD here at Carolina to pivot and do a career in science policy. Now, at the time, I did not really know what that meant. I wish there'd been a group like SPAG around, and some folks that were like-minded, and we could, spitball ideas off of each other. But I got a lot of pushback. Even my department chair at the time, when he kind of said, "Hey, I'm thinking about a career in science policy instead of tenure track R1, faculty," and he looked at me and said, "Oh, that's a wasted a career. What a wasted career." And I was like, and it almost fueled me up even more. But, at the time, I'm like, well, all I know to do, like my father used to tell me, is treat life like a chess game, and that every move you make, have some type of strategy behind it.
I was just going to say that Chris Mack emailed you about 9:20.
Yeah. Hey, Shay, I'm gonna mute you 1 sec. Hang on. Oh. Or you mute yourself. Okay.
That was interesting. I thought there was a question. I'm like, all right, questions, bring them on. So kind of, I was treating my career and my thoughts and my life kind of like a chess game, right? Either the move has got some type of strategy behind it, or it's kind of a useless move. It's just a random move. And sometimes that could be fun too. You're like, I don't know which way to go. Let's just move this piece here. So I took a policy internship in RTP, followed by another policy internship, just to have something on the resume. And then I lucked out. I was in a situation finishing up here. My wife had started a career. We were newly married. We knew that we wouldn't be leaving North Carolina. I was very interested in the PhD fellowships that you all just talked about. AAAS and AGU's got one. American Chemical Society's got one. I think the Astronomy Society has gotten one. But I just knew that I couldn't go to DC. That was not going to work. We wanted to stay in Raleigh. And I was like, how do I do state level stuff? And that's the other thing I found. There was a lot of there was a dearth of information and excitement around state level policy. It was all the federal model, all like, oh, you've got to go to DC and cut your teeth on Capitol Hill, which is great. But you've got to understand the federal policy machine is a totally different monster than the state policy machine, which is a totally different monster than the local policy machine. And I will argue, after almost 20 years of experience, you can potentially affect change at the state level much quicker and much more effectively than you can at the federal level and have the bigger impact. But we can get to that later. So there was this opportunity to grab a job in state government with the Division of Coastal Management in then DENR, now DEQ. And I thought, okay, well, it's in Raleigh. It kind of does what I do. I'm a marine geologist by training. And it's working on policy. So it wasn't great pay. It was actually horrible pay, but it was my foot in the door. So I had a couple internships. I'm like, okay, now I can put this in my resume. And it turned out I loved the job. And part of this was luck. So part of this is taking advantage of, when you have opportunities. Sometimes you think, oh, that's a lot of work, but it's a really high impact, high profile project. So the first thing I fell into was they were trying to write sediment criteria for beach nourishment projects, right? You pump sand on the beach to stave off erosion, protect infrastructure, boost tourism, all that stuff. Save private, homes, save public buildings and parks. And we just had a couple bad projects in North Carolina with clay on the beach and cobble and boulders on the beach. So I got to step into that and finish up the sediment criteria with the science panel. And that was pretty cool. First state ever to do that, to define what the true grain size should be. And then very quickly realized that there was a hunger on the commission that passed the regulations for coastal management, that they wanted to take a look at all of the setback policies on the ocean front. And so I jumped into that. And that was like a 3 to 4 year project, but we completely rewrote all the state's oceanfront setback rules. And I would argue that they're some of the most progressive and forward thinking in the nation now. And that was a lot of fun, but it a lot of work. And about 6.5 years into that, I got the opportunity to meet some folks in the political world. And I just kind of happened to be talking to the right people and in the right place at the right time. And in 2010, the legislature flipped the majority parties from Democrat to Republican in both chambers for the first time in 141 years. I put this out there for context and texture, because I had started some side emails and some, meeting some folks. I did not understand the legislature. I did not understand really state level politics. I kind of was comfortable in my executive branch capacity. But I realized there was an opportunity. I'm like, wow. And I'd actually started talking to the minority leader, who then became the majority leader in the Senate in 2011, Phil Berger. And back the year before, I was like, if you all win, you're going to need a science advisor. And he goes, yeah, if we win, I think you should definitely send me your most current resume and let's talk. And that's really kind of how it all played out. I took the job over the phone, nothing in writing. I'd actually just taken a new job at DENR to work in the secretary's office as their policy advisor. Quit that job without anything in writing. Probably the smartest dumb decision I've ever made, or either the dumbest smartest decision. I don't know the best way to describe it. But it ended up falling into this situation where I was the science advisor to the North Carolina Senate, specifically to the president pro tem, who's the head senator, and held that role for almost 7 years. Was very naive going into it, which is probably a good thing, and politically naive, and didn't realize I would also be in the middle of so many big, emotional, ugly, complicated issues. Fracking for shale gas, coal ash, environmental regulation and regulatory reform, coastal issues with terminal groins and beach nourishment and inlet dredging, like all on my plate. But it was a great place to learn. And I will sometimes argue with people that there are generally two types of people in science policy, and I know this is oversimplifying it. There are kind of the theorists, theoreticians, the academics, the researchers that kind of study it, which is important. And then there are the practitioners. And a lot of times these folks, sometimes you could be a practitioner and go into the theoretical world and vice versa. Sometimes they talk to each other. But a lot of people will get out of school with a graduate degree and immediately think, man, it's time. I'm ready to be an advisor. Somebody needs to pick my big old brain because it's full of all this research and book knowledge coming out of the university. And if you can luck into that, that's awesome, right? But those jobs are few and far between. And you usually have to go and take an entry-level job and just cut your teeth. You've got to learn. So at a state agency, some of the stuff was menial, like going to public hearings and making sure the potential rule changes or proposed rule changes were actually published in the state register. Understanding the Administrative Procedures Act and the whole rulemaking process, because there are laws, and then the laws basically export some of that power to boards and commissions and give them quasi-judicial authority and give them rulemaking authority. And so then you have all these boards and commissions, anything from the Board of Governors and the Board of Trustees that you'd be familiar with the University of North Carolina and the UNC system, to the Environmental Management Commission, the Coastal Resources Commission. I mean, if you name an issue, there is a board or a commission, and it's got appointments from the legislature, it's got appointments from the governor, it's got appointments from other agencies. So you need to kind of learn that. And this is if you're doing state stuff, right? And I know some folks are like, I just want experience to see what I want to do. And that's great. So you might have to explore a little bit. That's where internships can help. And sometimes you got to take the internship free just to get some experience and some contacts and something on that resume. Now it's great because we've evolved to where we've got organizations like this and we've got certificate programs, and those are amazing opportunities that I wish I'd had. I want to pause for a second and go back before I get to the next part of this discussion, which is more like a stream of consciousness, but it is logical. I did take notes here. I really liked what Ray was saying about science for policy and policy for science, because it's another way of saying what I've said before. If you've heard me speak, there's the science of policy and the policy of science. And again, that's simplifying the universe, but in the science of policy, which is really science for policy, you're using science, scientific data, scientific reasoning to generate policy. Saying we created this rule because of what we've learned over here in the lab and in the field. The policy for science is a little different, but kind of similar to, the policy of science is very similar to the policy for science. And that's the decision that somebody or a group of people make on what science gets done. So it's the policy of how we're going to set the scientific agenda for our nation, for our individual organization that we oversee, like the National Science Foundation or National Institute of Environmental Health and Safety or Department of Defense. Then there's the state level, and then there's even the university. When there's discretionary funding, somebody has to decide what the portfolio is going to look like, okay? What research is going to get done, who's going to do that research, how much they're going to get. There's only a finite number of resources monetarily to pay for research, so you have to prioritize research. There's a lot of great ideas out there that could be tested to test hypotheses and look at method generation and develop really cool pilot data. But somebody has got to make a decision about prioritizing that. And that's really, that's kind of the policy of science, okay? And really one way to push change over time is just study something for decades and decades and decades and build enough of a data set and an understanding that you then have the science to impact the policy changes. And a perfect example of that is climate change. Keep doing climate change research. You're going to know more about a complex system, and you're eventually going to get tangible things that can be done and suggestions. I love when I talk to students, I'm like, okay, so if you could change anything, what kind of policies would you put in place? I'd put in climate change policies. Okay, great on the abstract. What does that mean? Okay, you can't just go in and impact climate change ad infinitum. You've got to have very discrete things. And this is where science policy advising is very critical. Don't just say, oh my gosh, you know, this drug is bad, so it should be outlawed. I mean, you really need to get into the nuts and bolts. Here's why this drug is bad. Maybe we should regulate it. And if we did regulate it, here's the statute that we'd have to operate under. And here would be the organization that regulates it. And here's how much money it would cost. And here are the outcomes we expect. That's where the policy advising is really critical. You know, so when I got to the Senate, I had a lot of people come in and they had great ideas saying, here's a great idea for regulatory reform. This is a rule that's outdated and antiquated. It makes no sense. And it's actually in conflict with something else. And I'd say, hey, that sounds great, but can you show me where this rule is in the administrative code or this law is, and then what everything else is in conflict? Well, it's anecdotal stuff that we've heard from homeowners associations and builders, you know. It's like, no, the most successful policy proposals came in on a piece of paper saying, here's the issue, here's the statute that governs the issue, here's the proposed change, and here's why it should be changed. And then you've got a piece of paper with a roadmap. Now, I might not agree on the exact statute, but it gives me a starting point, or I might not agree on the language or even the policy outcome, but at least there's a place to start, because a staffer or a lawmaker or policymaker is going to be hit with stuff like this multiple times a day. And a lot of times it just ends up in a stack of paper on the desk, or a staffer ends up going through the email. And so let's pause here and talk a little bit about, you talked about science, you talked about policy and where they intersect, and you all, I think, have a pretty good feel for science of what that is and policy for what that is. But then there's politics, okay? This is the third circle of the Venn diagram. And politics, quite simplified, is gaining or retaining power. That's all it's about. And you got to break it down into its raw, simple definition of what it is. Okay, so now you've got to understand, as a scientist or an engineer or somebody that's interested in that and being in that STEM related field of policy, what can you and can you not change? Okay, can you move the needle? Because science may say one thing, but it could be one of 18 different variables. And those other variables are far more important in the political calculation that's taking place. And the political calculation, most of the time, okay, that doesn't mean it's all the time, and again, I'm oversimplifying, is how do we keep, you know, this seat? How do we keep this power? How do we make a decision that does not get us kicked out of office? Okay. Now, the true leaders, regardless of what side of the aisle, will make the right decision for the right reason, regardless of outcome. Okay. Those people do exist. Okay. And those issues do exist that are nonpartisan, you can get behind. But, you know, we kind of come into this hyper-partisan space now, and it becomes a lot more difficult, where no matter what you do, and I used to joke that, you know, the Republican Senate could have passed a bill to give everybody a puppy, and, you know, the lobbyist against people who are allergic to dogs will come out and start running mailers in their district around election time. You know, Republicans want to kill your asthmatic aunt, you know, and insert your issue there, but it becomes weaponized. And so as a scientist, you need to understand your job is to give some education, give some advisement, tell them, okay, here's the issue. Here's where I think you probably stand on the issue. But if you don't, you need to ask them, where do you stand on the issue? Okay, here are the date. Here's what I think could get you to, you know, a resolution based on where you stand on the issue. And here's how you justify it. you also need to run some oppo research to say, okay, and if we do this, either we create a new law, we change an existing law, or we eliminate a law, then here's what the detractors are going to say. Here's the negative hits we're going to get, and kind of understand that and be able to debunk that, because a lot of times it can be very scientifically straightforward, but politically complex. I'll give you an example. Most of you have probably heard of the compound Gen X found in the Cape Fear River, made public back in 2016. One of 10,000 plus per polyfluoroalkyl substance compounds, PFAS compounds. And a lot of these compounds are very bad, like the PFOA and the PFOS. Lots know about them. Those people are moving away from them. They need to be outlawed. But now the argument is, okay, do we outlaw all PFAS compounds, or do we outlaw some of them? Do we treat them as a class? How do we regulate? At what limit do we regulate? And so there's this whole argument of how we regulate and if we regulate. But even if we regulated everything tomorrow, which is impossible, what do you do about the 50, 60, 70 years of compounds currently in the environment? Okay, and the science. So you can have science say this is bad. You can still have people not agree to how to regulate, or if you're going to regulate, what's that threshold going to be of regulation? Is it going to be 12 parts per trillion or 0.1 part per trillion? And that's the other challenge with science, is the more we know, the less we know. The more data we have, the more confusing it can be to answer a question, and the easier it is to start throwing out alternative hypotheses and putting into question, well, you don't have all the answers here. I mean, could it be this? Could it be that? And analytical instrumentation is great advances have been made now in water quality. We can look at parts per trillion. In a few years from now, we'll be looking at parts per quadrillion. 30 years ago, we were looking at parts per million, and that was great. But now we're seeing things in the water that were already there that now we're seeing, and they're scaring us, but they were always there, but we couldn't detect them. So imagine what we're going to see in 10 years when we get to the PPQ limit. And some of that's going to be weaponized because some of it's been in your water forever. And we honestly don't know how it impacts our body, but it's such an infinitesimal amount. So there's a question up here before I keep running this into the ground. But this was already answered. Policy advising restricted to governmental labs. That was a good question, by the way. So let me jump to where I am now. And because I complained a lot about in the General Assembly, that it would be great if we could somehow utilize our university system and our universities better. The problem there is first you've got to say, okay, we're going to study this, okay? Because a lot of people want to make a policy change, but other people say, we're not quite ready for that. So let's study it and get some data. The problem is people want that study to be done in 3 to 6 months before the next session, okay? That's generally a glorified book report. And most of the time it was sent to an agency, sometimes to a university, but really people forgot about it, and then they did it in the last 2 weeks to turn it in by the deadline. But it was no real cutting edge science, or they would create a blue ribbon panel to get experts together for a year to talk every month once, and come up with some recommendations. But if you finally did say, no, let's do a real study here and take as much time as it takes, 12 months, 18 months, 36 months. And, we better find some money for it too, because it takes some money. Okay. What university do you send it to? I want to send it to UNC Wilmington because that's my district. No, I want to send it to Western Carolina because I'm an alum. No, it needs to go to an HBCU. We've got so many to choose from. All valid, right? All valid concerns. So I would say, oh my gosh, we can't even decide who gets the money, and we don't even know the expert that would handle it at that campus. And then a lot of times when a campus is getting new money, it takes 4 to 6 months to get that new appropriation from the budget office. And then if it's a fiscal year, so you only have 6 months then to spend it. Somebody on that campus has got to decide who's going to do the research. Well, that person even had the bandwidth. Well, I need a postdoc. I wish you'd let me know 6 months ago so I could have lined one up. I just can't pull one out of thin air. Or, oh, no, I've got another grant that's got the deliverables due in 2 months. Can't do it. So there was this bureaucratic gridlock on the best way to do science. So the idea was thrown out there in 2016 to create something called the Collaboratory. And that was a name used before. It came out of a National Science Foundation meeting back in the late 80s, talking about computer science. But it's really just, you know, a collaborative effort. Former Chancellor Folt threw that out. And so it was created, and there was a little bit of money behind it. But immediately there were a lot of folks that were skeptical about it, saying, oh, those evil Republicans that have done all these things with the horrible, how they want to basically undermine academic credibility and, you know, come in here and mess with science and just get the outcomes they want. I understand the skepticism. It makes sense. Okay. It did not catch me off guard. And then when I came a year later to say, you know what, I think I'd rather get back to academia and go over and manage the research over there. You know, it's like I had thrown, speaking of puppies, thrown puppies off the bell tower. Like, oh my gosh, now the horrible science advisors coming over, who helped, you know, the Republican Senate write all these horrible laws. But here we are 6 years later, almost 7 years later. And I've been lucky enough to be the executive director. We now have a nice staff that we've grown. And we've received almost 150 million in appropriation from the legislature, half of that being COVID related. And the criticism has stopped. I'm sure there are some people out there thinking we could do it better, or we should have a different portfolio, or more should go to this university over here. But, you know, we've done over 400 projects. We've got some technology spinoffs, some technology creations here to make water cleaner. We're working on a leukemia vaccine. You know, we're doing service, we're doing research and service to the state. And we'll either do a project we know the legislature has asked us to do officially or unofficially, or we will do a project that we think the legislature should know about. Say, you know, this is an emerging issue you should probably know about, and here's some data. Or we'll do a project that we think people are starting to know about, but we'll give some pilot dollars to put them, to that team in a better situation to pull down a larger external grant. We can give them pilot funding, test the methods, build the team, get some data, test the hypothesis, and that'll let them score higher with, you know, $250,000 or $1 million grant. So it's been really cool, and a bunch of laws have been changed because of recommendations we've made, because we are allowed to make science and policy recommendations back to the legislature. We have been embraced by both chambers. We've been embraced by both sides of the aisle. We've been embraced by all three branches of government. Okay, we're trying to start work with the judicial branch and kick off a study on racial justice, and redoing a study that was done out of Michigan about juries and their decisions based on race of the jury and race of the defendant. And we've done a bunch of projects with the executive branch, multiple agencies, and of course, most of our projects have been with the legislature. So I'm going to end there. That's a high level of kind of what we've done, where we are. It's been a tortuous path. I'm very delighted that all the hard work has seemed to pay off. I will say the collaboratory model, to the best of my knowledge, is unique to this state. I've not seen as robust of an institutional tie between the legislature and its university system. Certainly not to the dollar amounts that we've been talking about. The last biennium, the last 2 years, had you know, a biennial budget, but there was a budget in the first and the second year. That was an $86 million biennium for the collaboratory. Again, most of it COVID related, and the American Rescue Plan and federal dollars. But we're very big in the PFAS space. We're very big in the opioid space now that the opioid settlement dollars have been flowing. It's not a ton that the legislature has at their discretion, but we went into them last year and said, look, you probably want to do research. And that's one of the uses for this money. If you look at the settlement agreement, just give it to us and let us basically throw this out there as an open-ended request for proposals. Let's score everybody in a competitive grant process and get the coolest research done by the best researchers across the state. And we had far more applications than we could fund, which makes it easier for us to go back to the legislature and say, hey, when you get year 2 of the opioid settlement, how about you give it to us again, because we've got this many projects ready to go that scored very highly, and we could fund them as soon as we get the dollars. And that'll keep the research engine moving. we don't have to create any new business process because we're already here. We don't have to create any new budget flow. There was a lot of work in the bureaucracy on the front end on how to move money around campuses for research projects without going through their office of sponsored research. There were a lot of questions about, do we allow indirect charges off of our state dollars, which is generally for finance and administration. And that is for the kind of the support structure for the research engine. And our statute does not allow us to have indirect charge. So for every dollar we give to a researcher, they get to spend the entire dollar. Generally, for every dollar a researcher will get, say at UNC, 55 cents goes to the indirect fund to pay to keep the lights on and keep the equipment running and keep the building, maintained. And 45% goes to the researcher, 45 cents. So.
Thanks so much, Jeff. That was awesome hearing about your path. I'll kick things off with a question, and for others who may have questions, feel free to either put those in the chat or you can unmute yourself. My first question for you, are there ways that students who are studying STEM can get involved with the collaboratory while we're still studying?
You can. A lot of interest has grown in becoming interns. We do have some paid internships. We're all full right now for this semester. But if you're going to be around next year, you can email, you can go to our website, which is collaboratory.unc.edu, or you could just remember to email collaboratory@unc.edu. Say you're interested in a fall internship, and then attach your resume and tell why you're interested in it, and spend a little time on our website and look at our projects, look at our model, see if this is what you're interested in. And then if you are a master's or a PhD student, probably around April, May timeframe, we're going to announce a 1-year RA fellowship that we have in partnership with a graduate school. And we award one. And if you get that fellowship, your tuition is covered, your fees are covered, your healthcare is covered, and you also get a stipend. And that's funded jointly between us and the grad school. So there are ways right there to get involved. I'm just going to start telling dad jokes. So,
another question I had, what does the day-to-day look like for you working in your job?
never have a same day. So here's an interesting fact. Not really this time, but about 14 months ago, I was the only full-time person at the collaboratory. We had a part-time, many of you may already know Steve Wall. I share him with Institute for the Environment. Then we had a financial manager that helped move our money around. November of 21, I was able to bring our financial manager on full-time. And then I convinced Chapel Hill to start paying for our operations, which had been coming out of our legislative dollars. Chapel Hill agreed. That gave me the flexibility to start hiring people. So we hired a research director, a communications director, a grants manager. We're in the process of making an offer for an office manager. We'll probably go and get another project manager to work for our research director. So we're now on the top floor of Keenan Labs. Then we had to find space now that we had a team. So it's going to be nice to see what my day-to-days are this year, because now I can walk outside of the door and look at 5 or 6 people on my team, whereas a year and a half ago, it was just me. It was exciting, but it was kind of lonely, and it was kind of overwhelming because it was a lot of work. And we were missing opportunities to really drill down into the reports and look at the results, make sure they spent their money wisely, make sure they got, all the milestones that they said they were going to be, but also see what the implications of the cool research was, and then communicating that out to the legislature. Right now, budget season is starting to ramp up because the legislature's back. And one thing that is important is to let them know what we're doing and how we can help, and of course get ready to ask for money if they ask, hey, what type of money do you think you'll need for PFAS in the next 2 years? I'll give you an example. Next Tuesday, I'll be out in Kings Mountain, North Carolina, at Albemarle mining site, which is that region of the state is the largest lithium deposit in North America. So right now there's only one active lithium mine in the United States, and it's in Nevada, operated by Albemarle. They're looking to reopen the historic mines that used to be there that produce extremely lithium-rich ore. And so we're going to go out with the Speaker of the House and the Chief Budget Writer. They've never seen the site. We're going to take our researchers that are doing some work in the geochronology space to understand the deposits a little better, to maybe help map them out a little better and target, instead of digging up everything, targeting the ore-rich rock to decrease the environmental impact. It's an interesting site because it's only about 2 miles wide. So, oh, okay, we do have a question. I was just going to keep talking. North Carolina is, this electric vehicle thing came up pretty quick, but North Carolina is in a very interesting situation to be able to benefit from that, with not only the lithium, the silica up in the Northwest, and then the phosphate and the phosphoric acid that we produce out along the coast. But you know now, oh, that's awesome. And what experience was valuable? I wouldn't change a thing. I actually liked being naive and stumbling into some of this and not realizing that I would be the subject of crazy news articles and hate speech, just trying to do my job. But I turned out to be in the right place at the right time. Had I not decided to be in policy, I wouldn't have taken that coastal management job. I started talking to legislators in my spare time about the law and state politics and, you know, their feelings on coastal issues and offshore energy and things like that. I wouldn't have met the future head of the Senate that then hired me. And then the senators wouldn't have listened to me as part of the conversation and come up with the idea to create something called the Collaboratory. I don't think, you know, yeah, I made some missteps along the way. I probably funded some projects that weren't good investments, or I probably helped write some laws that were bad advice. But that's how you learn, right? You have to fail. And so I hope everybody also realizes that you've got to fail. Hopefully it's not a huge public embarrassment that's detrimental to your career. Sometimes it is. At any given time, I knew that if I made a misstep that reflected poorly on the body, the Senate, or the members, that I would be thrown aside as the sacrificial lamb. That's just politics. The other part about working for the legislature here, the Senate is not like the US Senate. They're not 6-year positions. Every 2 years, we reelect every one of our 120 House members and every one of our 50 senators at the state level. So my job security was in, scientists will appreciate how I describe this, 2-year aliquots. And that was a little unnerving, knowing that in any 2 years, if the majority party became the minority party again, I was gone. So that was high risk, but I think with high risk comes high reward. But it could have gone the other direction at any given time. And again, a lot of this was just luck, and hanging around as long as I did. I think the best tools you can have is trust and relationships. You've got to understand, if you don't know the answer to something, tell them you don't know the answer to something. Don't guess. Sometimes a split-second decision is made based on your advice. And if you don't know, or say, look, I don't know. Now, if you've got to decide in the next minute, here's what I do and here's probably why. But you've got to understand there's a whole lot of, we're taking a leap of faith here. What I think you need to do is maybe delay the vote for 24 hours so we have some time to look into it. Let me call some experts. Let me do some research. And it was good to guide them. So you had to know the process, right? You had to say, look, let's displace this from the agenda today and kick it to a committee meeting tomorrow. Or I tell you what, let's take it off the calendar at the beginning of session and ask the rules chairman to put it on tomorrow's agenda. No one will bat an eye. It's just going to get moved and we have some time to work on an amendment. And so you got to know the boring parts of procedures and how the rules of the chamber operate, and you kind of need to know some politics too. But those members really rely on that. And the other thing is they really rely on the advice you're giving them. So make sure you don't have an ulterior motive. Make sure you don't have a conflict of interest, okay? Make sure you're saying, okay, I'm doing this in the interest of the goal you want. You might also be asked to work on something you don't agree with. It rarely happened to me in the science and energy field, but there were a few things that I didn't like. I'll give you a quick example before we finish up. There was a member that got an earful from a well driller in her district, and they wanted to take the metal plate off of the monument that gets put on every water well drilled, because he just didn't like taking the time to bang out with a hammer and the different letters when the drill was, when the well was drilled. You got to put the date, you got to put the depth, I think you got to put the gallons per minute. And I kept telling the member, I said, look, the problem with this is sometimes paper records get lost, and the property owner wants to know the basic information about the well. Now, certainly none of this is critical, and they can drop a measuring tape and figure it out, but it's just easier if it's a monument on the outside. I tried, but in the end of the day, that's what the member wanted, and we got it written up, and they put it up for a vote, and it passed. Did I think that was a good idea? No. Do I think society's going to come unraveled at the seams because of it? No. I have to realize that, this is just my personal issue. I disagree with it. Really had nothing to do with science. And at the end of the day, I work for the members. They don't work for me.
So I think we have one final question before we wrap up our first event, and that's how hard is it to work on and think about science policy outside of your wheelhouse?
It could be very difficult. And that's where relationships are helpful, and knowing where the experts are and being able to go and talk to them. You're going to know. So what you need to do, though, is define the issue and talk to the member or the stakeholder. Say, what's the problem? And so sometimes, regardless of that area of science, you just need to understand the problem. Is it that there's a rule trying to govern it, or that they're trying to use something? I mean, it's just understanding the problem and then trying to go, okay, what do I need to talk to a scientist, or what's the science component here? But at the end of the day, we all understand science. Once you get that degree, you understand the scientific thought process, you hopefully understand how to set up a scientific study, and you should be able to look at least at a high level, was this study set up appropriately? Was it long enough? Did they have enough people to make a statistically significant, universe of a population to look at? You can start telling whether or not stuff passes the bullshit test or not. Okay. And that's important. And then if you got to drill down and say, okay, let me go read this paper or find some other seminal articles, but never be afraid. I guarantee you, if I had called anybody in the university system and said, look, I don't know anything about genetics, but I'm the science advisor to the Senate, and I've got some questions. Could we set up a meeting real quick so you could give me a primer? Or can you look at this proposal? And then it gets tricky. It's like, I don't know, I need to talk to my government relations person at the university. But sometimes you don't have that luxury, and you got to do the best you can and say, look, we only have 24 hours. But always tell the member you're advising the shortcomings. Like, I get it. You got a short period of time. I'm going to do my best. This is not my wheelhouse. It'd be great if we had some more time. Or maybe you could say, look, maybe instead of doing the policy change where we could have unintended consequences, let's actually do a study and get the data that we need and take a year to think about it and actually gather some more information. So sometimes that's a very safe spot to go to, and one that I went to on a couple occasions.
Great. Well, we have reached 2 o'clock. Thank you so much, Jeff, for joining us. This was a really awesome way to kick off our spring semester. And for everyone else who attended, I just put the link to our certificate series event tracker in the chat. So if you would like to get a certificate in science policy, we'd love to see you at our other events this spring. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your days to be here with us, and have a good rest of your Tuesday. Bye, everyone.